So you want to know what the world's fastest boat is, and it's actually going to be pretty surprising to you if you didn't know this, because one of them is actually made out of wood, and they are older boats. They're not newer boats like you would think of with these newer boats with all the technology and all the stuff, so it's actually very surprising. Now, before we get started though, I want to thank our show's sponsor, PartsView.com. They are a marine parts and outboard superstore. They have all the things that you could need for your boat and for your outboard, easily to look up. They have maintenance kits. They give you everything that you could need for your boat, and they actually have a discount code for you to save $15 on $150 or $50 on a $500 purchase if you use the links and the coupon codes in the description below. The world's fastest boat is actually pretty surprising because it is actually a wooden speedboat built in Sydney, Australia, in the backyard of a man named Ken Warby, which got the world speed record on water in 1978. The boat's name is called the Spirit of Australia, and it is a hydroplaning boat. Now, it's interesting because the official record was 317 miles an hour, and it had a peak speed of 345 miles an hour. Mind you, this is a wooden boat back in 1978. This is not, this is 40 years ago. This isn't these new fiberglass, really encapsulated and safely built boats that we have today. This is a wooden boat in the backyard of Ken Warby. Now, the engine that he had on the boat is a jet engine taken from a Fiat G91 jet fighter plane, so it's a jet engine, and the engine is called a Bristol Siddeley Orpheus jet engine, which is a Westinghouse J34, which did produce from 3,000 pounds of thrust to 4,900 pounds of thrust, depending on the year and the model and which one you had. The one that he used was a Bristol and had about 5,000 pounds of thrust, so it must have been a newer model. Now, in order to get horsepower from thrust, we do need to do some converting, which can be depending on what you're using for your numbers. So as far as the 5,000 pounds of force or thrust, we have to calculate that off of speed. And if we take the speed of the boat and we do 340 miles an hour out of 5,000 pounds of thrust, that gives us a horsepower of 4,600 horsepower, which is insane. But if we calculate it off of the plane speed, which this jet engine in a plane would do 655 miles an hour, and do that, that would give us a horsepower of 8,733. Either way, that is a lot of horsepower. Now, before Ken Warby got this speed record, earlier, there was another boat called the Bluebird K7. This was the fastest boat in the world from 1955 to 1967, until the Spirit of Australia came in with Ken Warby. This was also a hydroplane ran by Donald Campbell, that unfortunately he also ended up passing away in 1967, trying to beat the records that he had set previously between 1955 and 1967. But this boat had a top speed of 276 miles per hour or 444 kilometers per hour. Its engine was also a jet engine taken from a plane and was also a Bristol Siddeley Orpheus. The engine is called a Metropolitan Vickers barrel axial flow turbojet engine. Pretty fancy, I know. Horsepower, again, keep in mind we had to do some converting to get the horsepower of the engine, but it had a thrust of 3,500 pounds of force, and it would be calculated at a horsepower rating of 2,576 horsepower based on the 276 miles per hour and the 3,500 pounds of force. Now, as far as the world's fastest boats or the fastest speedboats of today, these are going to be the boats that are used in the powerboats or the boat races. The boat races are going to be a little bit step above your recreational, which we do have a list of recreational speedboats as well, but these are going to be the speedboats. These are your power cats, your powerboats. These are going to be the P1 and P1 offshore, the Class 1 type race boats, which they also break down even further than that in different classes based on outboards, weight, horsepower, different stuff like that. But these boats are going to be your skaters, your MTIs, your victories, your mystics, the outer limits, your motions. These are all going to be those power cats and the class 1 speedboats. The top speed is going to be depending on the different classes of whether or not you're going down into the outboard class or you're running the power cats. But depending on that class, the speeds of the boats are going to range from 115 to 130 for the lower class, the the outboard, stuff like that. And then all the way up into the 160 to 180 mile an hour range for the Power Cat, your Class 1, your P1 powerboat races. Though most of the boats will get into the upper 190s and even the lower 200 mile per hour range for the top speed of the boats, being the MTIs, the Motions, the Outer Limits, the Victories, the Mystiques, Victories, all those. Most of the engines in the upper tier, the Class 1, the P1, are going to be inboards. They're race engines, a lot of 1150s, 1350s, Mercruisers. They're inboards with outdrives. And the horsepowers are going to range from 450 all the way up to 1350. For some reason, I keep thinking that there's an engine that is a 1550 or a 1650 or something like that, but I think I'm wrong on that. I don't know why I always think that there was a 1450 or 1550 or something for Mercruiser or Mercury Racing. I think it was an 1150 to the 1350. So not sure why I always think that, but that's stuck in my mind from somewhere. But then we have the world's fastest recreational boats. Now, these are a little bit different because these are where we get into the popular sandbar boats, your poker run boats, the boats that people are taking trips to the Bahamas. They're making long runs, Lake of the Ozarks, stuff like that. But you're more recreational. People are using them to run around in. These boats are not your Power Cats, where you're not going to put a Power Cat on your lake and just run up and down the lake in your Power Cat, because they're built for racing. These are built for speed and your go fast boats that you want to put all your friends on and run around the lake. Now, these are going to be your Donzies, your Nortex, your Cigarettes, the Midnight Express, your Formulas. Those are going to be more of this type of boat. Most of them are going to run in the 70 mile an hour to 90 mile an hour range, though some of them will get up into the hundreds depending on the boat and the layout, the model, the engine package. And again, most of them are going to be inboard, outboard, or they're going to be running outboards. Nowadays, most of them are running outboards. You got a lot of Nortex, Midnight Express, Formulas, Donzies, Cigarettes. All those are the ones that have 4, 5, 6, 450 horsepower outboards on the back of the boat. Those are going to be more about your recreational style. As far as the world's largest outboard as far as horsepower is concerned, it is still, as of today, going to be Seven Marine 627 horsepower outboard, which they're no longer in business anymore. Volvo shut that down, but it did have 627 horsepower, though Mercury now has the 600, but 627 is the top line of today as far as the amount of horsepower produced by an outboard, and those came in about 90 to 100 grand when they came out. And a bonus, we do have the fastest electric boat so far is Princeton University's Big Bird. And this electric boat broke the record and now holds it at 114 miles an hour. So that is the best that we have for the electrics. I want to say I calculated that down to 182 horsepower based on how you can convert an electric engine to horsepower, because it's totally different, but that is about what we have. The engine for Big Bird was an electric outboard that was co-developed with Flux Marine. Flux Marine is an electronic outboard manufacturer, and those are the world's fastest boats. For our next comment, though, we have Eric, and says about how much for a full rewire of a 27-foot boat. So this is going to depend vastly on what you want to do with the boat. On average, for a 27-foot boat, depending on if you're doing it yourself or you are paying someone to do it, how much stuff are you changing? For just the rewire, and that's changing out your switches and all the wiring in the boat, battery switches, breakers, and fuses and stuff like that, you're probably going to be in the boat for roughly $3,000 to $6,000 just in the parts. If you're changing the components on the boat as well, you're probably going to be in the $10,000 to $13,000 range because of all the components. And then if you are changing out the components and the electronics, being your VHF, your radio, and your Garmin, your GPS transducer, all that stuff, you're probably going to be pushing $20,000 to $25,000 depending on what packages you go with. And then if you pay someone to do that, you are probably going to be looking at anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000, maybe even $50,000 based on what you put in that boat. Being a 27-foot boat has a lot of space. Is it a cuddy cabin? Is it a cruiser? Is it just a center console? Because the different things that you're going to have on the boat are going to vary, because the 27-foot boat, I mean, you can have a lot of different types of boats with a lot of different types of electronics and stuff in the boat, because 27 feet is getting into be a larger boat. And then Jeff Platts says, I asked you during the live about Vevor hydraulic steering. Yeah, we did a live last Tuesday, a couple weeks ago. That was awesome. If you missed it, we apologize. We do a live every week for our Boaters program and channel members. So if you have not joined the Boaters program, you can do that. We do have lives, which is a lot more interactive, asking questions and stuff like that, opposed to the podcast where it's mainly answering the questions. But he put the Vevor hydraulic steering on his 1996 21-foot Boston Whaler Outrage, and have to say he's impressed so far. Installation was easy and it handles similar to the Sea Star. Also paid $400 compared to $1,900 for the Sea Star. So Vevor is definitely something that I want to try out. I'm glad that you did say this, Jeff, because yeah, for $400 for the complete system, it is, I mean, that's crazy. But yeah, to save $1,500 on the hydraulic steering system, it would probably depend also on the horsepower rating. I don't know how high Vevor will go. I want to say that they only do like 150 horsepower. I don't know if there are systems you can put on a 300 or not. I have not looked into it that much, but I do want to try that, and I appreciate you letting us know that, Jeff. That is a great comment. Simplify says, is this stuff any good for a transom in a John boat? So now we're talking about PVC board. And I will say this, John. So PVC board is very, very soft. It is not near as durable as starboard or other types of plastics, but it is, you know, it's not going to rot. It's plastic. For using on a John boat, I'm sure you could use it as a backing plate, maybe double it up so it's an inch thick, and use a transom saver, or depending on the engine. Because if you're just clamping the outboard on, say you've got a 25 horse and you're clamping it, you're not bolting it, you definitely want to put something in front of the PVC. But as far as the structure of it, using it as a transom, I will say this, we did use it on a 13 whaler about 10 years ago. I helped a friend of mine. We did a transom out of the PVC board. So, and I mean, he did most of the work. I was just kind of hanging out but I did see it done, and it seemed to work. The boat's still being used 10 years later. So, you know, it held up there, but that's encapsulated in fiberglass. So a lot of the strength is the fiberglass, opposed to on the John boat, you're going to have the outside layer of the John boat, which is going to be either aluminum or some type of metal, depending on the brand and what the boat's made out of. But I would say using it as a backing plate, if you double it up, make it an inch thick, it's going to give you enough strength to hold a 25 horse. I mean, obviously, depending on the John boat, I mean, you don't want to put like a 90 on there or something like that. That might be pushing the limits, but it giving it the thickness gives you strength in the structure. And having an outside layer being a transom saver and the outside layer of the boat, that metal is going to give you, it's going to be your strength, and the thickness of the PVC board is going to give you strength. So, I mean, I think you could do it depending on how you did it. You know, you have to be careful. You don't want to just put the clamps on the PVC board, because the stuff is soft. It's going to smash it, and it will fail. Your engine will fall off if you just use that PVC board. And then Southern Marsh says, what does that bleach do to metal? Well, it's just like any other chemical that you use, any other kind of cleaner. You know, I wouldn't really worry about bleach doing stuff. I mean, you could worry about it if you just leave bleach on there, like wires, rubber, plastic, any other chemicals. I mean, acid, bleach, and different kinds of cleaners, stain removers, on, off, Windex, acetone, contact cleaner. Any cleaner is going to be harsh on the metal, the aluminum, the fiberglass, your gel coat, your paint. It's going to be harsh on that. But depending on what you're doing, usually when you clean something, you clean it off, you really want to immediately put some kind of a protectant on there. So like, if you're trying to use one of these harsher chemicals like bleach on metal, you want to clean it. And once you get it cleaned, you want to polish it with something, some kind of wax, Alumigard, Colonite, the Aero Wax, something that's going to put a protective layer on that metal, that gel coat, that paint, whatever it is. You want to put some sort of protectant on it, because if you leave any of that stuff, especially gel coat or metal, even the aluminum, as soon as you get rid of the protective layer that's on the metal, that's usually on there from either polishing it, compounding it, waxing it, whatever, has been done to that, there is a finish on the metal. As soon as you break through that finish, the metal is going to corrode, it's going to rust, it's going to degrade way quicker. Just like gel coat. Gel coat is porous, it absorbs. So if you strip all the wax or the ceramic or whatever the protecting layer is on the gel coat off, it's going to get dirty and stain 10 times quicker than it did when it was protected with that wax or whatever protectant was on there before. So just think about that whenever you're using harsh chemicals. Just clean them off. And then once you get the thing clean, put something on there. Even if you do a cheap wipe-on protectant that just gives like an oil base or some sort of a wax film on top of it, that's going to really protect the material, whatever it is, and it's going to keep it from staining, rusting, or degrading like the metal will if you just pour bleach on it and then leave it there. Peter Smore says, curious about attaching quick hose disconnects to an outboard on the flush port to make flushing easier. I tried it on my Yamaha 300 and it seems to work without kinking the coolant hose, but I still wonder if the tighter bend in the hose is restricting flow to cool the engine. Is this a good idea or not? Well, basically on pretty much the vast majority of outboards, the flush port is not part of the cooling system per se. What I mean by that is that your cooling system is designed to cool the engine, and your flush port is basically just a hose that ties into that system. So usually there's a T-fitting or a spot on the block or something like that where the flush hose just attaches there. So when you flush it, it just ties into the cooling system. It is not like an integral part of the cooling system where your telltale. So on certain models like Yamaha, stuff like that, telltale actually is the cooling water that's coming through, say, your rectifier regulator or the air cooler on the front of an F350 or something like that, the VST, your fuel rail, your fuel cooler. The telltale, if that blocks that water flow that cools your fuel, the air, your rectifier regulator, that is an integral part. Whereas your flush port, that's just tying into the system and flushing it out. It's not like, it's not going to create a restriction or block the cooling water that is flowing through the cooling system of the engine. So I wouldn't worry about that. Also, doing the quick connects, that's a lot of times a really good idea. A lot of people love doing that. We just did a Flushmaster, which we're going to be doing something with Flushmaster, which is a really sweet setup. It's a system that you can just put on your dock. You can put it on your boat, and you put a garden hose to it. You set the timer, hit on, and boom, it'll flush the engine. It's pretty sweet. But those kinds of systems, that flushing, those quick connects, a lot of that is based on the user and how you use it. We have done that where a lot of people will tie into the cooling system and then put the quick connects on the boat somewhere. People that can't really get around the engine. So like if you look at some of the boats, the way the engine is designed with polling platforms and tow bars, pontoon boats with fuel tanks in front of there or whatever, the engine's not always accessible. So if the engine is not accessible, or say you're 75 years old and you can't bend over and lean around an engine to put a flush port on, that's why people tie into those systems to flush the engine and put a quick connect inside the boat, opposed to just using the one that's on the engine already. So just kind of some food for thought. D. Ginta says, personally, I think what BRP did to their customers when they exited Evinrude is the definition of unreliable. Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on that one. That's pretty funny because, yeah, the way they did, the Evinrude customers, Yeah, they did them pretty dirty because, I mean, between dealerships shutting down, parts supplies not being there, and now all these people that have warranties and need to get work done on their engines, there's no dealers, and the dealers that are there, they're very hard to get into. Sometimes you have to drive 2, 4, 6 hours away just to get your boat in to get service to, get your 10-year warranty. You got this 10-year warranty, but you got to drive 6 hours away and have your boat sitting at a dealership for 3 months to get work done. So, yeah, I mean, the way they exited, yeah, I would agree with you, Ginta. The way they exited Evinrude is the definition of unreliable. User IZ5 says, thank you for all your content over the years. Has helped me tremendously. Thank you, user. Not sure why you don't have a name, but I have an -- Mercury 90 horsepower two-stroke. Getting mixed information online. Can I get your thoughts, please, on running without the thermostat? Boat lives and primarily only ever runs in South Florida warm waters. Thank you for your input. So basically, what your thermostat does, just in order to kind of get this question answered, your thermostat controls the engine temperature by controlling the flow of the cooling water. Now, this becomes a problem when you think of condensation. Think of warm parts, a hot running engine setting fuel on fire, cool water, cold water temperatures, and humid air, being water at sea level or coming off the dew off the lake. So warm parts, cold water, and humid air. I mean, those are what builds condensation. So that condensation on a 4-stroke, it's a problem because that builds in the crankcase and you can build up water in your crankcase. So if you take the thermostats out on a 4-stroke and you run in really cold water, or not even that cold of water, for an extended period of time, you're going to build condensation in the crankcase, which is going to fill your oil pan with water, make your oil milky. You're going to lose lubrication. It can be a problem. If you're running in really warm water like you're talking about during the summer when the water's 80, 90 degrees and the outside air is also 90 degrees, generally you're probably not ever going to see a problem because the engine temperature is up, the water temperature's up. You don't really have the scenario where you can build as much condensation. In the winter, it could potentially be a problem because on a 2-stroke, you're not building that condensation in your crankcase like to get to the oil pan. The fuel and oil and air rolls through the crankcase. That's how it lubricates your crankcase, the cylinder, and all that, and it's routed around into the cylinder. So you're going to be building up condensation or moisture. I mean, it's a minute amount. It's very minimal amount of moisture, but it does. I mean, it's moisture. So longevity wise, you could be creating damage to the engine, wear and tear, think rust and corrosion, stuff like that, because it's water and it can be corrosive in that type of an environment. So in the winter, you could potentially eventually see a problem. You might not ever because of the temperature being so warm, but at the same time, in the wintertime down here, it does get kind of cool. So you could potentially see a problem. I would try and run the thermostats in the engine. I don't know why you would not run the thermostats. If you can't run the thermostats in the engine, there's something else going on. Otherwise, a lot of reason why people will either have hollowed out thermostats or they will have, no thermostats is because you're running in a lot of grass, a lot of area where you're sucking up a lot of stuff and you're getting grass, sand, dirt, other stuff that's sticking in your thermostat causing a problem. So I understand that situation, but that's kind of the discussion and the insight that I have on it. Whether or not you should or shouldn't, realistically, like a lot of people used to do with Optimaxes, is there's a screen for the cooling water and they would put filters in there. So you would route the filter and you would just put that screen in there where you could take the screen out or the filter and dump it out. So if you're running in real shallow waters, you're getting into seaweed, you're getting into grass, stuff like that, and you're sucking that stuff up, having a filter that you can kind of dump out real quick, that's what a lot of people did to get around that problem. But other than that, I would try and run the thermostat because, again, it's what controls the engine temperature and maintains it by controlling the cooling water. So you really want to run that thermostat. Sibelius says, owner of a 2002 Evinrude 175 fixed Ram. Got to change the starter. It's supposed to be the battery or electric issues, but was the starter, now runs good. How can I know when I have to change the outboard? How long can it last, and how can I notice when it's dying? So that is a interesting question and great topic, because there isn't really a way of knowing when an outboard is going to fail. There are signs, but there is not really a formula based on, I have this many hours, it is this age, and this is how much life is left in the engine. There isn't really anything that's going to tell you that. Maintenance and condition are definitely going to be big factors in that, but generally you run an outboard until it dies. By that, I mean the power head locks up or it just won't run right anymore. Also, if the components on the engine, say you have a 30-year-old engine and the wire harness, the stator, the TPS, the injectors, well, 30-year-olds might not have injectors, but the components of the actual engine are now starting to wear down to where every time you take the boat out, the stator went bad. Then my CDI box went bad. Now my ignition coils went bad. Then the flywheel magnets failed. Then the TPS went bad. So if every time you take that out, because all your components on the engine are 30 years old, they just fail pretty quickly. Because take the ignition system, for instance. Everything's 30 years old, and your stator, you change the stator. That stator, before it failed, was not producing what it should be producing. So it's a lot weaker than what it should have been. You change that stator, and now all of a sudden you're getting brand new power, like it's packing a punch. So now you're providing way more power to the rest of your ignition system, being your CDIs or your ignition coils, spark plug wires, all that stuff. It's not used to getting that much. So now that makes your CDI fail, because it's now, because it's so worn out. Now all of a sudden it's taking more voltage, more amperage than it normally was with that worn out stator. So then it fails. Then the coils fail. Then this fails. Then that fails. The engine harness, the rubber has now degraded that's protecting the wires. Now you got shorts all the time, and you got to change out the wire harness. So when you get to an age point and you visually look at the engine and you can tell all these components are like failing, one right after another, you have two options. One, change the engine, or two, change all those parts. So at that point in time, the amount that you're going to spend, especially if you got to pay somebody to do it and you can't do it yourself, if you got to pay somebody to do it, paying that someone to do that and then changing out all those parts is probably going to be the same amount that you would spend on buying, say, a used outboard that's 15, 20 years newer with half the hours. So in a roundabout way of answering the question, there isn't a formula that's going to tell you how long the engine is going to last or when it's going to die. But the signs of what it looks like, if it's completely dirty and trashed out and like hasn't been cleaned in 20 years and is covered in salt, you can think that engine is not, it's probably not reliable, because it's, you can see how dirty it is. But generally, you run an outboard until it dies. So until that thing blows up or it costs you more money than it would cost you to replace it, then you just keep running it. That's pretty much the way that's pretty much the way I would run an engine when it comes to thinking about when to replace it. Tamarin, I'm not going to try and say your name. He says, I just bought an older model boat for a good price. It was a Yamaha F115 09 model with 350 hours. So we're talking about 2009 F115. Runs great, but how many more hours do you think I will be able to put on the motor? What can I do to make it last longer, or should I just sell it at a profit and get something newer? I got the boat motor and trailer for $6,000 in good condition. It is a G3 Eagle 180. So, Tamarin, bro, you're talking about 2009, so a 15-year-old Yamaha F115 with 350 hours on it. As long as that engine was taken care of and wasn't just left with the cowling off sitting on the ocean with salt water splashing on top of it, you're going to get hours and hundreds to thousands of hours more and years of use out of that engine. I mean, you haven't even broken that thing in yet. 350 hours and 15 years on a Yamaha. Yeah. Run that thing and don't even think about it. Yeah, you could sell it if you wanted something new. I mean, if you just want new, then yeah, you could do that. But if your concern is reliability and whether or not that engine is going to last a long time, yes, 15-year-old Yamaha with 350 hours is going to last a long time. You might get another 15 years and another 1,000 hours out of that engine. So I wouldn't be concerned about trying to change that thing out unless you're trying to upgrade to something with, more communication and stuff like that. Just do the maintenance, service it regularly, keep everything lubed up, greased, oiled, CRC on the engine, and that thing's going to give you a lot of use. It's a really, really reliable engine. Joe A says, first I heard of using grease on threads. Please explain. Seems like it would mess up the torquing of the bolts. I'm guessing, Joe, that you live somewhere in the north, probably not in South Florida or in a heavy saltwater, warm saltwater area, or maybe you're very new to boating and you're not really used to this, because grease is a must on outboards and bolts, because saltwater and corrosion, if you don't grease up your bolts, you're not going to be able to get them out, and it's going to be a problem. So you want to grease every bolt, with the caveat of, what are you doing? Are you rebuilding an engine like a power head, putting a cylinder block, he's putting the block together, or putting the cylinder head on it? On that situation, yeah, you would want to use whatever it is, Loctite, whatever it is that you're doing, based on what you're doing. Sometimes you're supposed to use Loctite, stuff like that. Based on that, yeah, you wouldn't use grease on your cylinder head, putting that cylinder head onto the block with the mating surface and making sure that that's torqued right. You would use what you're supposed to use and then torque it to specs. But for everything else, the chaps, the thermostat bolts, the water jacket bolts, the water pump impeller bolts, the prop shaft, the lower unit bolts, the drive shaft of the lower unit, all that stuff needs to be greased, because if you don't grease it, that stuff ain't going to be coming apart. Down here, if you live in Wisconsin and you are boating on a lake that is fed by melted snow from Canada and it's crystal clear, clean water, you're not going to ever have a problem with that. You probably are running an engine that's 40 years old, because you're only getting 30 hours on the engine a year and you only have a 3-month season. So on that, no, obviously you don't need that, because it's just not needed. But down here, heavy use, heavy salt, warm water, yeah, you want to grease them up, because you're just asking for a problem if you don't. And we'll do one more from Mr. George Washington. He says, how much per hour does it cost to operate, maintain, and store a $200,000 used boat? Well, George, that's going to vary. I can tell you right now, it's going to be anywhere from $500 to $10,000 a month based on what you're doing. So based on, $200,000 used boat, you can buy a lot of boat for 200 grand. You can buy a 21-foot bay boat, or you can buy a 32-foot boat and have twin engines on that thing. So based on, and also where you live. So if you're buying a 21 or a 23 bay boat, center console, plain Jane, not a lot going on. $200,000 in today's market doesn't buy a whole lot when it used to, but I still think you can get a lot of boat for 200 grand. And you live in, say, the middle of Florida, or, off the beaten path, or not, in a highly populated area where there's a lot of options to store and operate the boat. You could do it for $500 a month. Whereas if you live in, say, Marathon, and you got to store the boat at a marina, you could be paying anywhere from $500 a month to $1,500 a month based on the size of your boat. And then it's going to also cost you, depending on how much you use the boat, $500 to $3,000 in fuel based on how you use it. If you're taking this boat to the Bahamas every weekend, you're going to spend $5,000 in fuel. If you're going offshore 3-4 times a week, you're going to be burning a lot of fuel. You're going to be using a lot of, boat, chum, lures, all that stuff. You're going to be consuming a lot of stuff. So based on how you're operating the boat, that's the biggest key is, anywhere from, say, $500 to $1,000 a month to own, operate, and maintain and store the boat. And then up to, say, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 if you live in on an island and you're using a boat with twin engines, say a 32, and you're going out 3-4 times a week. Yeah, you could spend $5-6 grand a month to operate, maintain, and store that boat.